Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Coming in at serial 4, and especially after Dr. Banor, and after lunch, is a very serious handicap. But I'll do my best. In fact, Dr. Banor, I have to thank for inviting me for this conference for the first time, and he has assured me that regardless of the intensity of your applause, he's going to re-invite me next year. The good news is that I come from India, and India and Israel have a shared legacy, a historical legacy, a troubled neighborhood, hostile neighbors, and perhaps the oldest victims of cross-border terrorism. Today, I'm not going to speak about Al-Qaeda. And in this hour of pall of gloom and doom, I have to narrate a success story. And this is post 9/11 success story. And the success story is titled Defeating Insurgency in the 21st Century, the Sri Lankan Model. And the question is, can it be replicated? Now you may turn around and ask, what is an Indian doing talking about Sri Lanka when a more competent Sri Lankan is sitting here to talk about the Sri Lankan case? Well, there are two reasons for this. The first is that the Sri Lankan representative, I know, is a bit modest to blow the Sri Lankan trumpet. And the second reason is that as part of the Indian peacekeeping forces that went into Sri Lanka in 1987-88, we weren't allowed to complete our job. In other words, we didn't succeed in completing our mission, but the Sri Lankan military did. And so my paper will cover the Sri Lankan success story in about 6 parts. And the first part will cover the domestic insurgency and how an external actor can influence that domestic insurgency. The second part of my paper is on drivers of military, the drivers of the military option. The third is how the war-winning strategy was formulated. The fourth is the failure of the liberation tigers of Tamil Ilam, the Tamil Tigers. So like Osama bin Laden, they had their own leader, a gentleman called Prabhakaran. And the fifth is the cost of success, and lastly, the lessons. Now, the conquest of the Tamil Tigers by the Sri Lankan security forces was a resounding military success. Sri Lanka has set a new paradigm in the use of force by winning the first counterinsurgency victory in the 21st century, which it calls defeating terrorism. To many, the majority Buddhist Sinhala overpowered the minority Hindu Tamils in the culmination of a very ancient ethnic conflict. Colombo has shown that a domestic insurgency can be subdued with the right mix of strategy, political will, adequate resources, and all-out use of force, along with a conducive strategic environment. What is striking about the outcome is not just the complete annihilation of the Tigers as an organized military force, but also the decapitation of its entire leadership and capacity to wage residual war. Military coercion, we know, works in extremely limited and localized conditions. Even then, Sri Lankans did not seriously believe they would win against an unassailable and most ruthless terrorist organization in the world. India, which 2 decades earlier had intervened to quell the insurgency, this time stayed away. Although it provided strategic support, it too did not expect an outright military victory for Colombo. The Malayan emergency 1948 to 1960 is cited as a textbook example in defeating an insurgency, though the formal surrender of the Malay Communist Party took place only in 1989. The baptism of the tenets of counterinsurgency, security and development, winning hearts and minds, protecting civilians, and operating under a unified command was achieved by Gerald Templer and Robert Thompson, whose expertise was switched later to Vietnam, but without the same success. More recently, Angola, Chechnya, and Colombia figure amongst success stories. The former Deputy Defense Minister of Colombia, Sergio Jaramillo, recounting his country's success against FARC guerrillas last year at Wilton Park, rued the new challenge, and he told me how to finish the insurgency. To him and those who argue that there is no military solution to insurgency and terrorism, I would mention three names: President Mahinda Rajapaksa, his younger brother and former Army Colonel, Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and Army Commander General Sarath Fonseca as the three architects of that historic victory. General Fonseca is in jail, but that's another story, and I'll have to be invited to tell you that on a separate occasion. The Khalistani terrorism in Punjab, India, and the terrorism of the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka are two unique instances in history of terrorism where the state prevailed over the terrorists without conceding their demands. Over 3 decades, the LTTE rose to become not just the world's deadliest terrorist organization, it was also a 30,000 strong insurgent movement with an army, air force, and navy, each with suicide squads and running a parallel state. It occupied 1/4 of the territory and 2/3 of the coastline in the north and east and sought a separate Tamil state. LTTE was supported by an elaborate international network and funding of $200 million annually. It engaged in conventional, rural and urban guerrilla war and terrorist operations, finessed with innovative tactics. A serious mismatch, however, existed between the military and political wings of the organization, as the LTTE was entirely a one-man Prabhakaran show. Assassinating former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, whose wife Sonia Gandhi is today the most powerful leader in India, was Prabhakaran's strategic folly. With back to the wall, LTTE resorted to the use of civilians as human shields. Now, the drivers of the military operation, and I have 7 of them, the first being when 4 attempts at negotiations and 3 rounds of war, excluding the military intervention by India, over 20 years produced a stalemate. President Mahinda Rajapaksa made one final effort at talks. Second, Tamil Tigers rebuffed the offer, violated the 2002 Norway-facilitated ceasefire agreement, and blocked a water source in the east at Mavilaru in July 2006. In April and December the same year, the Army Commander General Fonseca and Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa were targeted by LTTE suicide bombers. While Gotabaya escaped, Fonseca was seriously wounded. Third, breaking the siege of the water source turned into the 1-year-long Eastern Offensive in which the East was liberated. Fourth, a split in the Tamil Tigers in 2004, probably engineered by the army, brought 6,000 hardcore fighters with its commander Karuna onto the government side. Fifth, between 2006 and 7, 8 ships of the LTTE called Sea Pigeons, which are integral to their resupply chain, were sunk by the Sri Lankan Navy on the high seas with crucial intelligence from India and the United States. This was a body blow to the LTTE war-waging capability and presented, according to the Sri Lankan military analyst Sankara Jayasekara, an 18-month window of opportunity to finish the LTTE. This was indeed the turning point of the war. 6. Still, there were many skeptics on the government side about taking the war into the north, the tiger's den as they call it, as previous governments had been content with containing the LTTE and seeking a negotiated settlement. 7. President Rajapaksa sought to break this stalemate. The northern offensive commenced initially with a limited objective of opening a main supply route to the north to the beleaguered garrison. Capture of territory and attrition were bonus, but luck favors the brave. Now the war-winning strategy. And there are 6 components to this war-winning strategy. The first, Sri Lanka had learned that their previous operations could not be completed successfully due to Indian interference escalating into intervention. Managing India's support, and please mark this, managing India's support and benevolent neutrality, complex as it was, with 60 million Indian Tamils 20 kilometers away in the federal state of Tamil Nadu, was pivotal to the success of the enemy, of the offensive, I beg your pardon. Without India's help, LTTE supply chain could not have been dismantled. New Delhi's cooperation and consent were orchestrated through diplomacy and defiance, using India's twin adversaries, China and Pakistan, as bait. Second, diplomacy also ensured the ban on the LTTE as an organization in 32 countries. The US helped in breaking the international network engaged in buying anti-aircraft missiles and other weapons. Third, President Rajapaksa cobbled a rare political consensus with popular backing to fight the war, not for a draw as in the past, but victory. With top political cover assured and a cordon sanitaire around the island, Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Army Commander Fonseca took a number of steps to transform the military, especially the infantry. The army was restructured and nearly trebled from 100,000 to 300,000 during the 33-month-long offensive. The Navy was modernized with brown and blue water ships, mostly from Israel and India. The Air Force acquired precision-guided munitions for their Kaffirs and MiG-27. Military procurement was put on fast track with the President and the Defense Secretary personally monitoring acquisition. The aim was to significantly redress the military balance of the last 2 decades and achieve a decisive military superiority over the LTTE. Clarity of mission, that's the 5th. Clarity of mission, adequacy of resources, and no political interference in operation, a soldier's dream, is what commanders were armed with. 6. A favorable international counter-terrorism environment permitted a humanitarian cover and tweaking of terminology. Thus, insurgency and ethnic conflict were made synonymous with terrorism and counterinsurgency with humanitarian operations. The last battle was described as the largest hostage situation in the history and the world's greatest rescue operation against the world's deadliest organization to free 300,000 civilians from the clutches of the LTTE. Such was the humanitarian language of military operations. All these words are not mine, but Sri Lankan. Now, how did the LTTE respond? Prabhakaran failed to appreciate the 9/11 effect when the international community moved against all armed groups. The increasing use of terrorism may have been operationally successful, but its choice ultimately overwhelmed the cause. Not only were Tiger supply ships sunk, the international network operating in 40 countries, 1 million Tamil diaspora, was constrained from raising funds and acquiring arms. Critically deficient of surface-to-air missile, security forces enjoyed virtually total air cover. They had none when the war started. Faced with multi-directional attacks on a broad front and shrinking manpower, the LTTE was compelled to hold and defend ground. Principally a guerrilla organization, it was forced to fight conventionally, Prabhakaran failing to switch to mobile guerrilla warfare, which was really their forte. And when it was too late, he fell into the trap of no-fire zones, taking civilians along. And mysteriously, there was no plan B. Now, on the use of force, according to Rand, military force is rarely the reason for the demise of terrorist groups. Terrorism succeeds only 7% of the time in forcing the state to give into its demands. Between 1968 and 2006, 4 of every 10 groups renounced violence and joined the political process. The question is, did Sri Lanka military employ excessive force, attracting the charge of high kinetic counterinsurgency, where hearts and minds and protection of civilians took a backseat to shock and awe? Techniques were allegedly used which commanders should never use. The immunity of no-fire zones and the commitment on non-use of heavy weapons are both under scrutiny for their breach. 2 dates, the 4th of February, Sri Lanka's Independence Day, and 14th of May, both in 2009, played a major role in hastening operations. Now, the cost of victory. Overemphasis on humanitarian operations with 0 civilian casualties was bound to boomerang. The alleged brutality of the final phase of battle led to state terror that it had pledged to defeat. By blocking access to foreign media and NGOs from the conflict zone, especially during the last stages of battle, the government earned the charge of having something to hide and became a war without witness. According to several humanitarian organizations and the UN Secretary General appointed panel on accountability, there is credible evidence, according to this report, that human rights violations occurred during the final phase of war, and some of these could constitute war crimes. BBC Channel 4 video, which now has 3 versions, 2 of the BBC and one Sri Lankan, has further muddied the question of transparency and accountability. Sri Lanka has rejected all charges of human rights violations. By refusing to accept an independent inquiry to investigate allegations of war excesses, the government has alienated itself from the West, European Union, and the United States, and forfeited trade concessions and other forms of aid. Military victory has led to nationalism and triumphalism, verging on, some say, authoritarianism, moving towards single-party rule. Key influencer India ended up ceding strategic space to China. Now the casualties. Inconsistencies about figures aside, between 2006 and 2009, according to government sources, rebels lost 22,000 fighters, while government forces suffered 6,000 killed and 27,000 wounded. Mark you, this is only between 2006 and 2009. Civilian casualty figures vary from 0 to 40,000 killed in the last phase of war. The gains. A country goes to war, and I don't need to tell this audience, on the calculation that it will end up better, in a better state than before it started the war. Sri Lanka's growth was being negatively affected by the war by 1% of the GDP and was struck at around 4 to 5%. Sri Lankan military has been seen to be very productive by winning the war for a mere $5.5 billion between 2006 and 2009, which is just 4% of the GDP. It has returned the country to an 8% GDP growth rate path. Compare this, they say, to the $1 trillion the US has spent on unfinished wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. For the last 2.5 years, not a single terrorist-related violence has occurred. Peace and tourism are back, but fear and insecurity have not gone away. Now the lessons, there are 7 of them. The first, the combination of decisive military superiority, strong political will, popular domestic support, and a favorable international environment were indispensable to Sri Lanka's resounding military success. But military success alone does not constitute conflict resolution. Number two, 2.5 years after the closure, a brilliant military victory marred by alleged war excesses is incomplete, as political reconciliation and root causes have not been addressed. Ignoring the reconciliation process in Afghanistan, we all know, led to the resurgence of the Taliban, not once, but twice. Analysts in Colombo say there is no need for political devolution, as more Tamils live outside the northeast, and the LTTE in any case has been eradicated. Resurgence of insurgency will depend on winning over the Tamils. The third, Sri Lanka made the strategic choice of a military solution employing optimum force as preferable to a long-dawn fragile peace. Ironically, it is being called to justify its military success given the questions being asked by the international community. Fourth, whether countries will be able and willing to apply high kinetic force and force closure to war in the face of external criticism and threats of sanctions will depend on the political and diplomatic management of the external environment. Sri Lanka was able to stonewall attempts for a premature ceasefire and possible surrender of the Tamil Tigers. Equally, it has prevented criticism of its human rights record at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, not once, twice. Both China and Russia are protecting its flanks at the United Nations Security Council. Good use of hard and soft power, Joseph Nye calls it smart power. Fifth, in case of domestic terrorism, constrained by international humanitarian and domestic laws, liberal democracies, and we've heard this word democracy 29 times today and 17 times yesterday, and I'll say this again, in case of domestic terrorism, constrained by international humanitarian and domestic laws, liberal democracies will be loath to indulge in excessive use of force. Six, take India's case. The military is trained to create conditions conducive to a political solution. The army employs, and please mark this, the army employs, and I'm talking of the Indian army, employs minimum force in good faith, almost never using artillery and air power. Sri Lanka's use of disproportionate force was arguably justified to end the war quickly and on its terms. Seventh, while Sri Lanka won the shooting war, it lost the information war, failing to shape the international narrative. And by the way, the Colombian Deputy Defense Minister, my friend Sergio Jaramillo, attributed his country's success to 3 words. And he said, keeping democracy intact. And on lessons learned, he said, what not to do, and accounting for the cost of success. 3 divisional commanders were dismissed in the immediate aftermath of the war. I come to my conclusion, and I've just hit the red bell. Sri Lanka must face the international community, including the United Nations, with questions they are asking. It is in Sri Lanka's interest to end the proxy war. Sri Lanka enjoys a unique geographic isolation. It has just one neighbor to the north. It has neither gold nor oil. So for years the war dragged on till President Rajapaksa created the window of opportunity. Factoring both the cost of war and the price of victory to the question whether the Sri Lanka model can be replicated, the answer must be a resounding no. The strategic opportunity, facilitating neighborhood, the well-defined theater of operations, and neatly delineated population among which the Tigers operated are just not recreatable. Let's take the words of a Sri Lankan major, Hemanta Dayaratne, who in his counter-insurgency paper earlier this year called his country's winning strategy as a potential model applicable to similar situations. All counter-insurgency operations may be similar, but no 2 counter-insurgency campaigns are the same. I will stop here. Thank you for your time and patience.